It's been a historic week that saw a former president survive an assassination attempt.
If I had not moved my head at that very last instant, the assassin's bullet would have perfectly hit its mark, and I would not be here tonight.
Just days after the attempt on his life, Donald Trump's nomination was made official at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee.
President Donald J. Trump, having received a majority of the votes entitled to be cast at the convention, has been selected as the Republican Party nominee for President of the United States.
Trump also named Ohio U.S. Senator J.D. Vance as his pick for vice president, a man who once referred to the former president as America's Hitler.
I officially accept your nomination to be Vice President of the United States of America.
Welcome to the Republican National Convention of the Trump era.
I'm WABE Politics reporter Rahul Bali.
I'm WABE education reporter Juma Sei.
And this is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. Juma, welcome to the show. Thanks for jumping on board while Sam is enjoying a little time off.
Of course, I'm happy to fill in whenever and wherever I can.
So, Juma, it's a question that people have been asking me, and I want to ask you, how did you find out about the attempt on the life of former President Donald Trump, and what was your reaction?
Yeah, Rahul, I think it's interesting that you bring this up because I was thinking earlier this week about how I will never forget that moment. I'm back home in Portland, Oregon right now, and I found out about the assassination attempt while we were preparing meat for my younger brother's graduation party. And I was literally walking back from the grill when my younger cousin looked at his phone, looked up at me and goes, "Yo, they shot Trump." At that point, everyone congregated around the TV and we were kind of hooked for the next hour as we were finishing the preparations ahead of the celebration.
You know, Juma, I had just gotten back from the pool Saturday. I actually did not take my phone with me. And when I did look at it, there was a message from our managing editor, and it made no sense because I had no context. You know, after that, between X, which is what Twitter is known as now, and bouncing around different, TV networks, there was so little information. And of course, that allowed, misinformation and bad stuff to fill that void. And I think it took about 2 hours before, kind of the realization of the basics of what happened.
Yeah, Rahul, I completely agree. I feel like it was hours of a lot of us just operating in ambiguity. So moving on, we have heard from a number of Georgia leaders in the aftermath of the shooting. And I'm wondering if you can share some of what you've heard.
So during his Sunday sermon at Atlanta's Ebenezer Baptist Church, as the senior pastor, Democratic U.S. Senator Raphael Warnock had this to say.
We must condemn this violence. We must condemn violent acts and violent words. One leads to the other. One reinforces the other. Hear me. Violent acts and violent words. Scripture says life and death are in the power of the tongue, and we are seeing the ways in which that is literally true. There is a coarsening rhetoric of political violence in our country that must be condemned no matter who does it or unleashes it.
We heard similar sentiments across the political spectrum, which now brings us to Milwaukee and the Republican National Convention. And quickly, it was clear that the convention was going to go on. Republican State Representative Mike Chokas of Americus is in Milwaukee serving as a convention delegate. And I talked to him early on in the convention. He said folks were still trying to process what happened in Pennsylvania. He used the word shock, but he also said this.
We're all united, and, we're going to go in and talk about, what policy we need to do and what policy we need to promote and so forth.
By the way, Juma, one interesting detail the representative also shared with me was the arrangements of many of the delegates. They were staying 53 miles away from the convention site at a resort. So basically, it was 1 hour each way, just something I found interesting.
Yeah, definitely interesting. Honestly, it feels like just an average day of Atlanta traffic. But anyways, let's move forward here. So let's go to one of the key moments of this week when former President Donald Trump selected a new running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance.
So let's do a quick biography on J.D. Vance. He first came onto the national scene in 2016 with his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy. He's 39 years old, served in the Marines. He's a lawyer by training and has been in elected office since last year. He is in his first term as a U.S. Senator. Now, moments after the selection, I talked to Georgia State Labor Commissioner Bruce Thompson. He's also a convention delegate, and he talked to me while he was in the convention hall.
We are a state that has a very strong military presence. J.D. Vance can obviously connect with them. For the Republicans to win this, we got to make sure that we're expanding beyond just rank and file voters. It's no surprise that we need Hispanic voters. We need African-American voters. We need our Republican turnout. We've got to have turnout, and we've got to expand our base. J.D. Vance does that. He has a way to be able to connect people like many others don't.
But of course, not everybody is on board with J.D. Vance.
You know, especially on the Democratic and liberal side. One of the more interesting conversations I had this week was with Democratic State Senator Josh McLaurin of Sandy Springs. He and Vance were roommates during their first year at Yale Law School in 2010 and 2011. Now, for a number of reasons, the two drifted apart, haven't talked since 2016. But McLaurin came into the headlines a couple of years ago when he shared some 2016 messages between the two where Vance had some unflattering things to say about Trump.
Called him a demagogue, the fruit of the Republican Party's collective neglect, cynical a-hole like Nixon potentially, or again, the big quote, potentially America's Hitler.
McLaurin believes Vance has changed his politics from being a never-Trumper to being a true convert to the Trump world.
I'm less concerned about the flip-flop itself because so many Republican politicians have flip-flopped on Trump. I'm more concerned about the level of anger and contempt that JD has brought to his politics, which I imagine is the fuel for his conviction, right? In order to kind of gear himself up and be what the party needs, he has to feed himself this fire hose of contempt and anger for who? The media, the left, anybody who basically attacks Trump is contemptuous to JD. So that's how I think he's managed to get to this point.
Now, Vance has owned his past comments and says he regrets them. So, Juma, this is likely going to go two ways. On one side, Vance arguing that he's converted on Trump and that so can you as a voter. And others are going to argue, how can you go from calling him America's Hitler to being his vice president?
Yeah, Rahul, I do think it's going to be interesting to watch how the sort of Republican ticket navigates that through line moving forward. But J.D. Vance is not the only Republican who's had a complicated history with the former president. Here in Georgia, there is Governor Brian Kemp, and you spoke to him while he was at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. What do you have to say?
So before I share that conversation, let me give a shorter version of the history between the two men. In 2018, then President Donald Trump endorsed candidate for governor Brian Kemp, which clearly helped him win the Republican nomination. Then in 2020, after Trump lost Georgia by less than 12,000 votes, Trump asked Kemp for help, including, hey, can you call a state legislative special session, in the hopes of lawmakers deciding to select a different slate of presidential electors for Trump. That, of course, didn't happen. Other efforts didn't happen, which led to a chasm between the two men, along with Trump supporters and Kemp in Georgia. In 2022, Trump backed former U.S. Senator David Perdue's Republican primary challenge, but frankly, Kemp destroyed that effort. He got 74% of the vote. Kemp effectively won the primary and his rematch with Democrat Stacey Abrams with his own political machine, not the state party's, which is still dominated by Trump backers. That brings us to this week in my conversation with him. Governor Kemp tells me the reception for him in Milwaukee has been really good with most people. He had issues with a few. As of when we taped our conversation Wednesday afternoon, Kemp tells me he has not spoken with the former president during the convention or even this year.
like I've told people, look, I don't need a phone call to support the ticket. I've said I was going to do that all along. It's important for him to win Georgia. It's important in my eyes for us to win Georgia. And for the second cycle in a row, keep Georgia red. We won in 2022 in the governor's race at the top of the ticket. And if we win with the presidential race in 24, it really sets a good tone for us going in to 26 and pushes back against the narrative that Georgia's a blue state or a purple state, because we're not. As long as we have a good candidate, we have a good ground game and do the fundamentals we need to do, we can continue to win in the future.
As interesting as it is to see if Governor Kemp campaigns with former President Trump or Vice Presidential nominee J.D. Vance, more importantly, is going to be access to the political machine that Governor Kemp has built in the state of Georgia.
Okay, so Rahul, earlier we heard from Senator Warnock about political rhetoric. I'm wondering if Governor Kemp had anything to say about that himself.
So, Juma, let's bring this full circle and hear what the governor had to say about overheated political rhetoric.
I think it is a good time for everyone to just take a look in the mirror and be careful of their use of words and their tone when it comes to our politics. And, certainly both sides can be found guilty of that. But also think we have to have a lot of grace with people.
By the way, we'll be posting my full conversation with Governor Kemp at WABE.org.
All right, so with that, let's take a break. This is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast.
Welcome back to Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. So, Juma, we're going to focus on some of your recent reporting. Can you start by framing what you've been looking into these last few weeks and why?
Yeah, so I've been gathering string on a story about Black voters, and my premise is that Black communities in swing states like Georgia will be one of the most important voting blocs in the upcoming presidential election, particularly for the Democratic Party.
And to underscore that point, Juma, we should note that in 2020, the turnout from Black voters in South Carolina was critical to Joe Biden's victory, and that momentum carried him through the November election.
Exactly. And I think the reason that is so important is because this isn't a new dynamic. Black folks are some of Democrats' most reliable voters, particularly Black women. Here in Georgia, we've already seen a concerted effort from President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris to tap into the community and share what they've done to help Black folks in their first term. But there is a narrative that Black support for the president is waning, especially among Black men.
So, Juma, what does that mean for Republicans?
So for Republicans, that lack of enthusiasm is an opportunity. On one hand, low Black turnout in November is more likely to hurt President Biden than it is Donald Trump. On the other hand, muted allegiance to Democrats ostensibly means there are historically blue voters who could flip red this November. So we've also seen Republican efforts to court Black voters, men in particular. Now, I should note that polling from the organization Black PAC suggests that Biden's support in battleground states like Georgia has improved in recent months. But these overarching dynamics are still a major animating force for both campaigns in this election.
So, Juma, what did those outreach efforts look like in practice?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with the Democratic side. President Biden's speech at Morehouse, I think, is the first thing that we should turn to. For folks that don't remember, he delivered the commencement address this past spring. I don't think it's an accident that the president chose to speak at the most prestigious college for Black men, as reports suggest that he might struggle with these voters. Since then, I've covered Vice President Harris's repeated visits to Atlanta. In the first visit, she spoke at the national nonprofit 100 Black Men of America's annual conference. Comedian Steve Harvey moderated the discussion, and he framed it like this.
I'm throwing a lob. This is an alley-oop for a dunk, because this administration needs to get the word out of what they're actually doing and what they're actually accomplishing, so we can stop all this foolishness about what you're doing for Black people.
And Harris rolled with him, flexing wins like almost $160 billion in student loan cancellations and the fact that medical debt no longer affects credit scores. She also talked about a program for first-time homebuyers and efforts to make small business ownership more accessible, including to folks returning from incarceration.
Can I go back to a word you said, Juma? Repeated visits.
Oh yeah, it felt like Groundhog Day, honestly. Less than a week after the 100 Black Men of America event, Harris was back in Atlanta to talk about gun violence with Quavo, 1/3 of the iconic Atlanta trap group Migos.
You know, Juma, in 2022, we saw Republican outreach to Black voters. We saw the RNC open an office in College Park. What are Republicans doing this time around in Black communities in Georgia?
Yeah, so on the other side of the aisle, we've seen a couple big outreach events. The week of the debate, former President Trump zoomed into a roundtable discussion at Rocky's Barbershop in Buckhead. He was in conversation with a group of Black business leaders and notable Black Republicans like Congressman Byron Donalds, Congressman Wesley Hunt, and Dr. Ben Carson. Later that week, a similar crop of folks held a Congress Cognac and Cigars event at a cigar bar south of Metro Atlanta.
You know, Juma, I'd love to hear what voters are telling you about these events. You've spent a lot of time reporting in the community.
Yeah, I really have. And here's one of those moments where I think that some reporting transparency is helpful. So most of the voters I've spoken to at these organized events have been predictably optimistic about the Democratic and Republican tickets, respectively. But that isn't what I've heard outside of these circles.
Do y'all think that the current presidential candidates, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, care about Black people and Black existence in time?
It's a no and a no. I'm going to tell you why. It's a hard no on both. I'm going to tell you why. So you cannot change the hearts and the minds of people. If folks are wired in that way where they got that sickness of, racism or whatever, that's how they riding out. And Joe Biden and Donald Trump definitely are not change makers.
That's Ernest Hood. We spoke at his place called Ernie's in the Cut in Old Fourth Ward. It's a grooming gallery and community space for folks to chill in the neighborhood. Hood hosts Way Back Wednesdays every week, and it's a space for folks to kick it, chat, and listen to music. Ern's usually spinning records and bumping Fela Kuti or some other kind of very Black music in the space. Now, the rest of my sound bites come from the last couple Way Back Wednesdays.
So, Juma, it is striking to hear someone say that Biden and Trump don't care about Black people because they're not change makers. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so I think that the perspective of folks at Ernie's in the Cut is telling of a much larger dynamic. So we have Democrats and Republicans trying to engage the community, but a significant crop of folks who aren't showing up / aren't invited to these organized events aren't feeling the energy. And what they do see, they chalk up to pandering. Something we should know is that the events that have been sort of curated for Black folks have been happening at cigar bars. They've been happening at barber shops. The group that I talked to at Ernie's in the Cut also noted that a few months ago when President Trump visited Atlanta, he went to Chick-fil-A. They also pointed out a campaign ad of Joe Biden's where he meets with a Black family, and what they have for dinner is chicken from the Southern fast food chain Cookout. So these are all the reasons that this crop of people feel like these outreach efforts aren't coming from a genuine kind of place. I spoke with a new person or a new voice to this conversation named Ashton Francois, and here's what he had to say about his outlook for November.
This election is the most ridiculous, comical thing that I've ever experienced in my 40 years. They're both ridiculous, equally, for different reasons, but they both ridiculous. And it's an insult to my intelligence that this is the only two options that we got. We're sitting here talking about Joe Biden and Donald Trump? Word. There's nobody else? That's crazy to me.
Hey, Juma, did Ashton tell you if he was going to even vote in November?
Well, so here's that exchange. I start by summarizing what he told me earlier in our conversation.
So you're not excited about Biden. You're not excited about Trump. You feel like voting for a third-party candidate like RFK would be functionally throwing away your vote. But you do plan on voting in November.
Yeah, I'll vote.
Do you know who that might be for?
No. I really don't want to vote for Biden. I feel like it's an insult to my intelligence. How far will this go?
Now, something I should just say coming out of this cut is that sentiment of how far does it go is something that I heard from a number of people. Something that I heard almost universally across the board was that folks felt an obligation to vote because of a sort of ancestral duty as they'd seen it because of the ways that Black folks fought for that right in the civil rights movement. But at this political moment, at this juncture, they feel like the options in front of them aren't enticing, they aren't exciting for them. And because of that, they're questioning whether or not this system is something they want to take part in at all.
Juma, as we wrap up here, I want to say thank you for the time and energy I know that you have put into this reporting.
Of course, I feel like part of why I do it is because I feel like a lot of the communities that I've been able to speak with are voices that aren't often centered in other kinds of coverage. So it is a pleasure and privilege.
And that's it for this edition of Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. You can get more Georgia politics at wabe.org/election2024.
Plugged In is a production of the WABE Politics Desk. Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick. Now, if you appreciate the reporting you hear on this podcast, subscribe and leave us a review.
Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Bye, y'all.